All right, so welcome. I want to talk about practical rhetoric tonight, and I want to cover a few topics of rhetoric, but I want to start by discussing what I mean by practical, which is that like discussing scansion and technical things like that in our second week, I think that these terms can be intimidating and overwhelming and can also often drive us away from their practical usage. And I'm not going to dive too heavily into this sort of rhetorical terms. I would encourage you, if you enjoy this stuff, to dive deeper than I'm going to tonight. There is worth to be found in all of these things, though people disagree, but in general, the thought on Shakespeare's rhetorical devices is that he used over 200. So any sort of deep dive into the fullness of what he was doing is not going to be helpful. It's going to be overwhelming. We're going to get lost in it. And the other danger is that I think just the word rhetorical, people feel like they're going to get lost in an intellectual exercise and not a practical exercise. So I want to address 3 rhetorical devices tonight that Shakespeare uses a lot and that I personally find very, very helpful in my work. And I hope they will help you. I want to present both what they're about, but also the practical ways in which you can apply them to your work as ever endeavoring for craft, just the craft of what we're doing. This is not an intellectual exercise. This should be something that you can repeat. That doesn't mean it's not interpretive, but it should be something that you can repeat and rediscover every time based on the same rules that we'll talk about. So that is the idea of looking at rhetoric in a practical way. I want it to be applicable and I want it to be playable. And if we're looking at it in any way outside of that, it's not helpful to us as actors. So the first of these that I want to look at tonight is antithesis. I think it's what you're going to encounter most often in Shakespeare. I find it to be the most helpful. I think you will find it in every play. You'll find it in almost every scene. And actually, you'll find it in almost every speech. Every scene and speech we work on, we'll be finding examples of it. In its most basic form, antithesis is the opposition of one idea or word against another. And Shakespeare uses it to clarify ideas by contrast. And that clarifies either the ideas of working something out as an individual or using them this against that as an argument. And actually, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm going to go through about 5 or 6 examples of the use of antithesis, but you can find a dozen examples that I'm not going to bring up. And I don't just mean in the text. I also mean in forms of antithesis, how it is used and why. But in its most basic form and its most famous form, to be or not to be is antithesis. You're taking 2 ideas and opposing them against each other. And what Hamlet does in that most famous of speeches is an exploration of discovery, right? So he is trying to understand his argument, whether or not he should kill himself. Some people will argue about whether that's actually what he's debating, but whether or not life is worth it and why people in durance and in pain and with problems don't just kill themselves. So to be or not to be, that is the question. And then a larger form of antithesis, when we get to phrasing, comes next, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So you have those are 2 ideas of antithesis opposed against each other. So we open with 2 words, be or not to be, and we follow with 2 phrasings or ideas against each other. The speech continues, and there is antithesis throughout it as he compares one idea against another. The contrast heightens both ideas and makes it possible for him to explore them and make decisions. He makes revelations through them, which takes us back to our 3rd or 4th lecture in which we're talking about new ideas and discovery. It's as vital an antithesis as anything. Another example is antithesis used in making an argument, when you're saying this against that. A famous one is Portia's Quality of Mercy speech, when she says, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. And so she is setting up justice against mercy. Justice is what Shylock is seeking. Mercy is her answer to it. An interesting thing to look at in this is that antithesis demands context. Now, good and bad, be or not to be, may be obvious and sort of not debatable. But justice and mercy are not necessarily antithetical. They are not necessarily opposing ideas. In this argument, in Portia's argument, they are opposing ideas. And in Portia's argument, unlike a Hamlet, she is not exploring the ideas for the sake of understanding them. She is creating antitheticals out of them in the hope of convincing Shylock of something. By showing the antitheticals, by showing how mercy is greater than justice, she's hoping to succeed in her argument. In this case, she fails, but she does deliver, one of the most famous speeches in Western drama. So they require context. Antithesis is also used in establishing the world, and often when it is used in that way, in establishing dissonance. So another very, very famous antithetical is fair is foul and foul is fair. So you're taking two antithetical points and saying they're the same thing. So they remain antithetical, but in saying that they're the same thing, you're establishing a discordant world, a world that is not at peace, a world that is not balanced in the proper way. This also applies to the idea of the mythological, as we talked about last week. And in a similar vein, antithesis is a means by which characters or ideas are established against each other in contrast to each other, whether or not it's an argument. So another one from the Scottish play is Duncan's line, "What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won." So the antithesis between what the Thane of Cawdor lost in his misguided rebellion and what Macbeth has won in his loyal service. Little does Duncan know. So this is not an exhaustive list. You can find, I'm sure somebody smarter than I can point out a dozen different versions of antithesis, but I think these are the major ones. I'm covering a lot of the big ones. And I think the largest two you will run into is the Antithesis of Exploration, which is Hamlet, or the Antithesis of Persuasion, which is Portia. And so those don't necessarily cover everything, but they will cover a lot. So, and again, it clarifies the ideas by contrast. So practically, you run into antithesis in the work, and again, you will run into it in almost every scene, in almost every speech. What do you do? First of all, antithesis always, well, I'll say always, of course, there may always be exceptions, but always drives you to operative words. If Shakespeare has written out antithesis, you always want to lift both pieces of the antithesis. You need to frame them for the audience. And because they are almost always operative words, they are a key guide to your structure. So as we talked about in week 1, if you're taking the operative words, the operative stresses, and you're building your map of a piece by connecting the dots between them. Again, this isn't the relative stress of the verse. This is the 1 or 2 operative words per line by which you're building your argument. Antithesis always, 99% of the time, asks for those words to be part of your operative construction, part of the map you're building as you explore the speech or the scene. You must vocally lift them against each other. So it's not just about emphasis, it's not just about the direct emphasis, but about opposing them. So you want to color them differently. That can be about tone, weight, pace, all of the tools we have discussed. But you're lifting both, and you're lifting them in opposition. So you need to have a different point of view on each of them. And often you're discovering them, so you're coining them as you go. So how does, in the Portia example, justice, she probably has she is painting justice as an ill in this case. Justice ignores the benefit of mercy, and mercy is a good. So paint it as you will, use your tools, but you want to lift both words and you want to oppose them. You want to have a point of view on them. And like to the Hamlet example, you want to be aware of creating phrases. Often antithesis are larger phrases opposed against each other, and you'll create an entire muck of it if you try to emphasize every word in the antithesis against every other word. So try to create phrases out of them. So whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows, or to take arms, instead of suffer the slings and arrows, it's going to get totally lost. There's no way to create the opposition. You need to create phrases. And that is especially true with pronouns. Pronouns are so often used antithetically. And unless the pronouns are standing by themselves, you almost never want to lift them, but you do want to connect them into the phrase. He wins, he loses. So they're connected in the phrase, but the emphasis words are going to be the active words connected to them. You only want to emphasize the pronouns in opposition if they're the only pieces of opposition. Her versus her. But if it's her sword against her sword, and again, you'd want to color those differently, you'd want to tie them together, but you want to create them out of the more active words. I hope that was all pretty clear. I'm going to throw up a slightly longer example of antithesis into the chat. This isn't long enough for me to share a piece or anything, but it's from a lesser known play and one that I love. So I want to I'll throw it in the chat and you can follow it as I go through it. Let me see. Oh, I could have been better about setting myself up for this. Here we are. Great. So this is Ulysses talking to Achilles in Troilus and Cressida. Personally, one of my favorite speeches in the canon, in which he's talking about Achilles' lost honor because he refuses to fight. And Ulysses is using the idea that Ajax is surpassing him in honor to try to motivate Achilles to return to the war. Achilles wonders why his great deeds have been forgotten, and Ulysses is speaking about how that which is done is meaningless compared to that which is being done. So this is one piece of the speech with a lot of antithesis that I'll lean into. Then what they do in present, though less than yours in past, must o'ertop yours. For time is like a fashionable host that slightly shakes his parting guest by the hand, and with his arms outstretched as he would fly, grasps in the comer. Welcome ever smiles, and farewell goes out sighing. Oh, let not virtue seek remuneration for the thing it was. And to the question that popped up in the chat, I believe this is 3-2. I believe this is Act 3, Scene 2. I can confirm that momentarily. Yes, no, Act 3, Scene 3. This is Act 3, Scene 3 of Troilus. So that's an antithesis heavy chunk, but that's not unlike many chunks that you will find in Shakespeare, where there's antithesis all over the place, multiple words weighing against each other. And in that one, for example, things were pretty evenly balanced. One point of antithesis was raised, another was raised against it. You will often find phrases where a line will have 2 or 3 words that all oppose another 2 or 3 words in the following line. And it's your job to find the vocal coloring to continue the argument of the antithesis between those things. That's not as common, it's harder, but it is something to be aware of. So again, to keep it simple, you're using antithesis to clarify ideas by contrast. That is often in exploration, it is often in persuasion, but there's a million different scenarios in which you will be addressing antithesis. It is always useful for mapping your work, and it should always be emphasized and addressed. The next piece I want to look at is alliteration, but what I really want to look at is the repetition of sound. So alliteration is the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words, usually consonants. I could also talk about assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds, or consonants, which is the repetition of consonant sounds. These words are the kind of intimidating words that turn people off. If you want to go down the rabbit hole on them, I encourage you to. But what I'm really talking about is the repetition of sound. So language is emotional and dramatic in its sound, beyond its content. And it's something that I think modern drama does a lot less of. I don't want to speak fully. I'm sure there are many playwrights with an ear for this, but Shakespeare does it a lot. And I think we've probably hit it in every monologue and scene we've looked at. In fact, I can pull up examples from the ones we just looked at. You know, Helena, near the end of Helena's speech, there's all those S's. There's those plosive consonants in Lady M's speech. Anytime you see a repetition of sound, you want to take note of it and you want to lean into it a bit. The sound carries with it emotion and it carries with it drama, just in how our ear hears it. All repetitions of sound should be noted and leaned into. And then you have an interpretive thing to ask. What does this repetition of sound tell us? So the most basic example is that the repetition of sibilant S's sounds like a snake. Again, that's interpretive, but often Shakespeare does plug them in when somebody is being potentially manipulative. There was that repetition of S's at the end of Helena's speech, and Kendall wonderfully talked about it as like the air going out of a balloon, which was a beautiful metaphor for it. So this isn't, you know, I'm talking about craft, this gets a little heady, but they do evoke something. These repetitions of sound evoke something. You'll find a lot of plosive consonants, B's, T's, D's, in moments of anger or sort of violent expression. And when you lean into them, they will clarify the work. They will elevate the work. And so I encourage you to do so. You know, what is the as if for the repeated consonant, the sort of magic as if? These consonants are telling this story. It is as if the air is going out of a balloon, etc. You know, for the S's, a famous example is Leontes in Winter's Tale. Thy mother plays, and I play too, but so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. And you can lean into it enough to draw out that hiss. Hiss is both the sound of the snake and it is the sound of his venomous anger coming out. And so you have these repetitions of S's. I may do, one point is that this evocative use of sound is primal. You know, it gets to something beneath intellectual thought. It evokes something, if you tie into it, that you could do if you read the speech only on the consonant sounds. Now, there is a trope that emotion is carried on vowels and meaning is carried on consonants. I don't necessarily agree with that entirely, but I will say that there is room for opening vowels that does allow for emotion. The emotion often sits in them in a nice way. And I may well do a full lecture on Shakespeare's sounds and consonants versus vowels. I'm not going to dive down that rabbit hole tonight. But the repetition of sounds is valuable. It's easy to spot and it's helpful. One other side note, this is a small thing, really it should be part of a different discussion, but hard vowels draw the ear in a way that we often want to avoid. So the reason I'll encourage you to say methinks instead of me thinks is because me thinks draws our ear to that me, and it's totally unhelpful to us. So methinks. It's the same with amen versus amen. This isn't about a sort of aesthetic preference. Amen draws the ear less. Amen is harder. It sort of makes us listen to it. And often those words aren't asking for that. All right, so the final thing we'll look at, and perhaps the most intimidating, is irony. In its most basic form, irony is expressing meaning through opposites. So saying the opposite of what you mean. If it's pouring outside and you say, what a lovely day, that's irony. Part of our problem is that we're bad at irony these days. We're much worse at it than Shakespeare was. We usually use sarcasm. Irony is a rarer thing for us, and sarcasm is not the same. There is overlap, and I want to address sarcasm at the end of this section. But just know that irony is tough because it's tough. It's often tough to find, you know, because we're speaking about ambiguous meaning. And so often on the page, something that may well be ironic doesn't appear that way if you take its surface meaning. So it's only after really studying something, diving into it, understanding the full context, that you can even start to discover that it may be something ironic. So we do have that barrier of ambiguity, that at first glance, if you don't know a piece, you're not going to find the irony all the time. Now, the most famous example of irony in Shakespeare is Mark Antony's speech in front of the forum. I'll read it at the end if I'm feeling like there's time. But for Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. And he repeats that 4 or 5 times, and with each repetition, the irony gets less and less veiled as he builds his rhetorical argument. So irony, it's expressing meaning through opposites. Throughout all of this, I'm talking about verbal irony. I am not talking about dramatic irony or situational irony, both of which are literary things. They do exist in Shakespeare. They do not help us here. So we're talking about verbal irony. Irony is often humorous, but not always. There is usually an element of humor to it. The speaker almost always enjoys it. There is usually an obvious piece of it in its expression, but sometimes it's so deadly subtle that most productions and performances miss it entirely. And usually when you get to irony that subtle, there becomes debate about whether there actually is irony or there are not. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it always involves ambiguity and double meaning in word or phrase, and Shakespeare uses it all the bloody time. He uses it across his entire canon. You find it in every play. It's not as, I'll say, I don't think it's as common as Antithesis, but God, it is all over the place, and we recognize it terribly. So in practical terms, when you find the irony, or if you interpretively decide that a piece is ironic, how do you express that to an audience? Because like reading it off a page, if you deliver it straight, the audience will probably take it straight. So you have to frame up the multiple meanings for us, or at least the fact that there's ambiguity. So that's about emphasis, certainly, but it's also understanding what the point of view on the irony is, so how you color it, what it is doing for your argument will affect how you color it. So first you have to find it, then you have to understand it, then you have to discover your point of view on it, understanding the argument of it, and then there are some technical tools within that can help. You know, this seems obvious, but one is when you find the irony, place it in inverted commas or quotation marks. Another is placing them in capital letters. It's something that frames and sets apart the irony. How obvious you choose to be with that is a negotiation with your director or yourself or your teacher, because you can go, it's a difficult thing to manage. You can go too far. If you're too subtle and it's lost, it's meaningless. If you go too far, it becomes obvious and bleeds more into a potential sarcasm. Again, I want to talk about it because it's all over the works. It's the hardest thing to address. So framing it for our ears can be done, you know, you can practically look at it as capital letters. You can practically look at it in quotation marks, but a certain sort of framing that tells us that there's a double meaning here. There's a double meaning in that. So now, and then you got to decide how far you lean into it, how obvious you're going to be with it. Now, a note on sarcasm. This is a hard distinction. There is overlap here. Sarcasm, the purpose of sarcasm is almost always to mock in some way, and sometimes to hurt. So sarcasm is sometimes playful and can be kind, but it's always mocking. And sometimes it's really nasty. Irony is not. It can have those elements, but here, a better way to put it. In my experience, Shakespeare rarely uses sarcasm. So I've worked with teachers who say Shakespeare never uses sarcasm. I don't think that's true. I think there are some very clear examples of sarcasm in Shakespeare. But I think he uses it rarely. And the reason why is that irony carries with it ambiguity. It carries with it multiple meanings. It carries with it a deeper exploration of the subject matter. There is nothing ambiguous ambiguous about sarcasm. It is clear, it's surface, it's on the page, it's obvious. And I think that interested Shakespeare a lot less than irony. So while there is overlap, they are different things. And while sarcasm is much closer to our modern idiom and vernacular, I think Shakespeare uses it a lot less than we do, and uses irony, maybe not more than we do, but he and his oral culture were much more attuned to irony than we seem to be. So, how am I doing on time? I'm not bad. I'm going to look at Antony. I'll share the link to this. Just going to go through it once. I'm going to lean into the irony of it a bit, and I'm going to try to show as I go how it develops, how the veil of it thins as I go through it. So I'm throwing up the link to Antony in the chat. And it is about, what is it, a third of the way into the scene. I'll find it here. Yeah, so about a third of the way in, friends, Romans, countrymen. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept, ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? And I'll stop there. So I was probably making it a bit too obvious, but you can see how it builds and expands in the repetition of it. That is the most famous example of irony in ever. So those are 3 points of rhetoric. A scary word and scary phrases. I hope they help you target certain things down. I found them infinitely helpful in my work. And you're going to hear me talk about them in class, not in, but I will constantly be drawing attention to antithesis, to repeated sounds, and when I can find it, when any of us can find it, to the irony. Great. Any questions? If you want to, the chat's harder for me, throw it up there if you'd like. Otherwise, the raise hand option in the participants menu is easier. Alexandra, I'm asking Alexandra to unmute.
Hey, Charlie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
So in terms of looking at the language and the, you know, you were talking about irony, antithesis, and making the argument, a lot of times it feels like the characters, in making the argument, they repeat themselves again and again and again. Like the same idea comes back, but they're saying it in different ways.
Right.
And I just wonder from like an approach of like, if you translate that into the behavior and into the you know, the performance of it, you know, how do you do that so it just doesn't become this sort of list? And are you supposed to read something into that in terms of like how to approach the character and how they're making that argument? I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes total sense. It makes total sense. That's a great question. I have two answers. One, in the basic sense, repetition isn't of itself another rhetorical device. So when you literally are repeating a phrase like Cleopatra, I see, there has to be a development in the repetition. What are the multiple words, what the multiple uses do for us? That's the simpler answer. So if you have direct repetition, you want to develop it. You don't want it to be the same. How does the extra repetition serve either intellectually, is a discovery made in the midst of it, or emotionally? What further is happening in that direct repetition that needs expression through the same words, but obviously delivered differently? More what I think you're asking is when an argument is not literally repeated, but many similar pieces of an argument find repetition throughout a speech or throughout a scene. And I'd say that it's twofold. One, you have to, in your analysis and your understanding, you have to delineate what is actually different about these pieces, even if they're very similar. Because in the development, point two is that you want to be creating the development of an argument. So even if it's a similar point, what does point two have that point one didn't? And whatever point two has is a development of thought. It's a discovery. So what does point three have? And so you want to look at it as building an argument, and so sometimes it can be helpful to work backwards, right? So you look at the final point wherever it's made, and then you can work your way backwards and see how each point was added to create that argument. So even though we might be having repetition, a form of repetition as we go, it's incumbent on you to individualize the added points of argument and how those points build to the final argument. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does in an intellectual way, but not necessarily in something that translates into performance, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. So in a craft, as far as the craft, to the directly applicable, you need to shape every new point vocally, and often, if not almost always when building an argument, as a discovery. So I'm making point one, and then even if I'm just repeating point one, I discover point two. And then actually point two leads me to point three now that I'm talking about it. And so you're vocally shaping any new information as you build it. With that said, it's not always easy. Sometimes it does get dull and repetitive, but I think the practical approach, if you see repeated arguments, is to take whatever new is in there and make that a focal point vocally in shaping it as the addendum, as the new idea to what came before. That doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, but practically you want to shape anything new in a repetitious argument.
Right, because when we were going over Valentine, like, and there was a lot of like antithesis in that, like the, you know, the life, death, the night, the sun.
All over the place.
But a lot of it was him basically saying like, what is this good thing if I don't have her? What is this good thing if I don't have her? Then it's bad. And it's like, it's really kind of a different version of the same argument repeated again and again, but to create different colors so that not only it doesn't become this da 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 da, not just in the scansion, but in the
Yeah,
you know.
no, I hear you. And why not death rather than living torment? To die is, so that's the question.
Mm-hmm.
To die is to be banished from myself, and Sylvia is myself.
Mm-hmm.
Banished from her is self from self. a deadly banishment. So that's the discovery. So to be banished from her is worse than death. And then he tries to understand whether that's true. What light is light, if Sylvia be not seen? And so as he goes through this list, what joy is joy? He's trying to understand what there is to life without her. So the thesis being, why not death rather than living torment? And then he goes through being banished from her is worse than death. And then he has to understand that, because that's a deep decision. So light is light, joy is joy, feed upon the shadow of perfection. That's the next point. And then he tries to say, except I be, and then he tries to say, and feed upon the shadow of perfection. So maybe there's an alternative. Maybe I can survive by just the idea of her. But then emotionally, the argument drives forward with, except I be by Sylvia in the night, etc. So this next section is about, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go over the whole speech, but this next section is disproving the previous one. So he's in inner conflict. So his conflict within this speech is with himself, it's an early version of both a Romeo and a Hamlet. He's deciding whether life is worth living without this woman. He begins with the idea that it's not, and then he reasons his way through it. And the real discovery being, she is my essence. So I understand, I think you're making a good point, you're asking a good question. You could say that she is my essence is the same as the first line, why not death rather than living torment? But they're not. Death, and this is your job, this is our job as an actor. Right. Why not death rather than living torment? He hasn't yet discovered that she is his essence, that literally he doesn't exist without her. He's saying that at the beginning, he's saying being banished from her is worse than death. It's not until he discovers 2/3 of the way into the speech that she literally is me. So again, this gets complicated, and it's a really good question, Alexander, but she is my essence is a discovery. It is new. And so it's incumbent on us as actors to try to make that clear to an audience.
No, that's a great answer. No, it's very helpful.
Okay, good.
It doesn't mean I'll be able to achieve it, but it definitely clarifies.
Good. And yeah, it's not always easy. It is not always easy. Good. Any other questions? Oh no, sorry. Mute is good. Any other questions? All right. I'll check the chat. Thank you, Natasha. I'm so glad you're here. Great. East Coasters, that was an